Well, we are ready. Thank you for attending. For those who are just watching this is part of the series of conversations that we are hosting at Open Knowledge Foundation called The Tech We Want. But we are trying to explore ways to shape with agency and with full knowledge on how the technology works, what we use every day, from AI to software to hardware to data. And in this occasion, we are entering in unexplored territory for the foundation. I mean, we have worked a little bit in the past 20 years in some issues related to neural data, but we haven't looked deeply until now into the issue. My name is Renata Ávila. I'm the CEO of the Open Knowledge Foundation. And I want to, before we start with the panels and invite the experts in, I want to introduce you to this project, why we did it. But as this event attracted people who are not usually part of our community, we hope that they will become, I will also introduce you briefly to the foundation and the work that we do. So this event today is part of a broader initiative, an Open Neurotech Stack. And basically what we are trying to explore is how to use openness and practices and community practices that we have engaged over the years in the foundation against what we see as a threat of cognitive infrastructure of surveillance and control. The Open Knowledge Foundation has been around 2 decades and a half almost, and it is an organization that has worked from the day one in trying to establish openness as a design principle when we think of knowledge, data, and the infrastructures that mediate our lives. And we coined the open definition term. We have established standards and practices in many areas. We power most of the open data portals around the world. And as society and technology and this intersection had evolved, we are now trying to take a more intersectional approach in the work that we do. And we part from a very important point in this kind of work, and it is that we cannot have a conversation about technology if we do not understand how it works. And we cannot understand how it works if we don't not only gain the technological knowledge on how things are assembled today, but we need to further understand which of the way that things work today when we talk about technology are things that are like givens that we cannot change, settings that if you alter the technology will no longer function, and which are like decisions that are like deliberate decisions from those shaping the technologies and conceiving the technology, creating the technologies, and then deploying them in the market or in different sectors such as military, health, and so on. So for that purpose, to having a critical understanding of technology, not that deterministic one, and trying to have a collective conversation on how, as a society, we want to shape the new technologies that are coming before it is too late. We have been hosting these conversations called The Tech We Want. And we have started with different pieces of technology, more daily life technologies, but we are now entering this field. And the purpose is to try to challenge the status quo of technologies that we are examining, trying to find avenues to shape them in a way that embrace better the values that usually communities across the open movement embrace, and try to see if there's a space of action before the technology solidifies and is massified in a way that we no longer can intervene. And this is part of a new umbrella work of the organization that we have been exploring since 2024, which is called Frontiers of Openness. And it not only involves examining what we had in the past as a cornerstone for our work, the open definition, and see where openness is being open wash, to say it in a way, when openness is an enabler of abuse or extraction, where openness is a limited concept that needs to be expanded and explained, but not abandoning the value that guides us, rather analyzing how it can further help other areas. And in the list of challenges that we have been working on and that we have been exploring is space. Tomorrow we have an event about that, where we have been looking at the space commons and looking how different levels of intervention on what's going on in space. And neurotechnology, that is part of this work that we are going to present today. Critical knowledge infrastructures, which is a very interesting piece of work that we are doing with Wikimedia policy team. And in the future, we started exploring, because it intersects with the work that we have done in standards, biotechnology. About this project, basically, we started that as a very general exploration, and then we narrowed to two buckets where we think that our open movement can intervene, can have an impact, and can bring something new to the table. And that's basically the aim of this initial pilot prototype that we are running inside, which is understanding how these new technologies work, but with the caveat of that, understanding the limits of the technology, but understanding also the possibilities for these technologies to work with different parameters, with different settings, and with different architectures. And how can we shape these technologies with a positive agenda around it? The main goals of this project will be, of course, to lock our brain commons open. And by locking this open, I mean enabling a space of creation that is not limited, by proprietary conditions that block the possibility of people to do something around their brain data and what they can do with it, not blocking the possibility of a generative future with these technologies. And the other area that we are exploring is how to make commercial neurotech accountable from birth. What we have seen in the past in practice is that usually our advocacy efforts come too late, when the industry is already everywhere, when it's very, 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 very hard to reverse, and what is left to us advocating for the public interest is just patches that we can put through legislation, through regulation, to some controls, and a very hard way to, when damage is done or when harm is happening, a very hard path for regulators and for judicial authorities and police even to understand, reverse the path and understand where and why this damage is happening. So we entered with a lot of enthusiasm, but we hit a wall very quickly, because this field is very, very complex. And it has so many ramifications across different highly specialized areas that the main emphasis of what we have been able to do in these months has been just gaining the understanding of how technology works. And most of the day today will be about it, about understanding what is going on in the field, about understanding the concerns that are emerging around these technologies, and understanding each piece and how it is being combined right now with other pieces of already problematic technologies, very data extractive, app ecosystems, AI, and so on. But also part of what we wanted to do is to understand the narratives around brain-computer interfaces, but specifically the narratives around commercial brain-computer interfaces. We will see later in the conversations that there's two kinds, and what we really wanted to zoom in is in what you can, over-the-shelf things that you can buy in any jurisdiction, and things that people are buying. I mean, this is still not accessible. It's still not affordable. It's not as cheap as for massive adoption yet, but it is heading there. And unlike, as we were going to discuss today, unlike the medical devices, highly unregulated, there's a little bit of the wild west as it was in the past with surveillance technologies. And then we wanted to look at and understand the long-term plans and applications of non-medical BCIs. We know that the adoption, as Shoshana Zuboff has said, any technology with the ability of surveil and control will surveil and will control. So we want to just be guided by the experts, understand better potentially worrying applications at the workplace, at the at the field, at the military field, education, and other areas that might teleworkers, other areas that might be of concern. So what we have done so far is basically trying to understand the tech stack, and for that, together with my colleagues, we got a lot of devices and started to, from the consumer perspective, trying to experiment with ourselves and start to try to play with them, understand how they work. And from our experience, that hands-on experience wearing the devices and setting the devices by practitioners who understand data and understand generally, like the privacy frames and human rights frames was a very interesting experience, because it left us, it was not the same read 20 papers of neurotech that then experience neurotech ourselves. We wanted to prepare an experience to further expand this interaction with a series of workshops at an event that was unfortunately canceled in Zambia. We hope to make it happen in the future, because we have all design and experience. Also, the other thing that we have been looking at is how these technologies interact with other technologies and big data extraction mechanisms, and understanding the data pipelines and where, data storage, data portability, and the data agency that people could activate around them. The other part that we have been exploring is the narratives around commercial BCIs. It is, of course, this sector is not immune to all the narratives of magic pills, or magic substances, or magic exercises that will make you be an enhanced human and will give you superpower of concentration. All the narrative is around you being a better you through the interaction with these devices. Lifestyle, wellness, super performance is the narrative around them, and the wearables with high claims usually do not have accountability mechanisms to properly verify those claims, because usually there's a circumvention of more strict controls by being non-medical. And here an example of what we have been looking at, this is one of the most strict frames around brain-computer interfaces. And it's very interesting because China has invested vastly in this sector and is leading, together with the US, the race on invasive neurotech. But it is very interesting that in spite of having this very strict regulation, what we have discovered is that even in China, with these strict regulations, outside the regulation is, of course, all these gadgets that will be inundating our markets very soon. And And the third thing that we have been looking into is understanding how to apply lessons from recent struggles. So we have been looking at and this brilliant work done by Privacy International and Center for Future Generations and others in a little bit on how the battle against surveillance tech started, on establishing catalogs of the companies and understanding who is funding what is legally available in the market and what these technologies are doing. Is like the beginning to start, exploring a deeper layer on what is like more darker uses of these technologies. The other thing is that we have been looking into is what is the visible claim of what the device is doing and what is really doing in the background, and for that we have been drawing lessons from the brilliant work on consumer protection, on, again, surveillance toys and surveillance devices. But other two areas that we have been drawing lessons from are the right to repair, because one of the things that will be very interesting to look into is once we have these devices dealing with, at least interacting with our most intimate data, what can I do with this device? Is it something locked, or is it something that I can tweak? Is something that I can adjust? Is it something that I can adapt? Will it be interoperable with other devices? So there's an interesting route there on claiming more freedoms given the nature of the data that we are dealing with. And lastly, of course, interoperability, seeing how we do not end up with these neurotech walled gardens as we have end up with most of the technology pushed to the market in the last 15 years, but a more generative interactive ecosystem. I don't want to bore you because the real substance will come with the experts, but the initial impressions that we have is that brain literacy is very limited, even among communities with strong data and privacy literacy. The technology is far from affordable, shaped by specific values depending whether it was made in Asia, whether it was made in Europe, and so on. And it is, the same way that biometric technologies didn't read third-time people, these technologies do not read. It's very difficult, and there's a lot of frictions for users from different kinds, let's say, it doesn't consider certain, hair or complexions and so on. It's very hard to tweak and to adapt and to even use as a user outside the average white person or the average Asian person. The hands-on experiences wearing the devices are very relevant to generate more public awareness. There's what we have so far is either the super hype announcements in media, or when we see exhibitions, it is like the high technologies that what is being demoed and used. The $300 devices. Usually, people super into it will experiment with it and try it, but it's not it's an experience that's more online and it's not physical. You will not find it in shops, and it's very interesting to experience so as to understand better the concepts. What we also found, which is very promising, is that there's abundant creative spirit around these devices, and artists and young hackers and students in different universities are doing a very rich bottom-up interactive movement on creating things with these technologies, with the pieces that are still open and affordable and available. And one gap that we have identified is that there's still no clarity, of course, on which are the real plans on deploying these systems at scale without a real opt-out. For example, if teleworkers, if workers in certain roles will not be able to opt out of these technologies. And then, of course, a very, very exploratory question on what will be the link in the future to prove humanity and to prove consent around these technologies, and whether we are, like, whether there's a potential that, brain data will be the way to consent in the future, use at scale, at large, and as giving away our last bits of freedom. That's all from me, and it's just to introduce you to the day. What we are going to be discussing today mostly is the technology behind, and then how to govern these new technologies, and then we will have two keynotes to explore, the broader landscape and have, a more deep, more philosophical conversation about the future of our, the privacy of our thoughts, the agency that we could have with these technologies, and what are we risking if we remain, avoiding the topic, and what can we achieve if we engage in it. So without further words, I'm sorry that I spoke for too long. I leave the floor to Solana Larsen, who is going to introduce who has been working in the field for many years, and who's going to introduce the first panel and moderate it. Thank you. And thank you for attending.